July 1st, 2027. Homeland Territory number 1, the new United States. John Wilson's life begins the same way every morning, in fear. At precisely 6 a.m. Eastern Time, he hears the chime. It's a text message from the government. There is no way to block the message or ignore it. By law, every adult in the new United States must maintain an active cell phone number and have it registered with the U.S. Treasury. Even if it wasn't legally required, there is no other way to buy or sell anything. All transactions must, by law, take place on the government's blockchain using the U.S. digital dollar, the USDD. Before the end of the Republic, John Wilson was one of New York's most elite investment bankers. Thanks to his connections to powerful politicians, he easily survived the second national COVID shutdown, and he survived the Civil War that followed. But that was more difficult. His wife and children were killed in a suicide bombing in the first days of the war, before most people even realized a war had begun. John had known what was coming. It was obvious to anyone with a working knowledge of history and economics, but he didn't act in time. Antifa targeted his condominium building because it was the tallest in New York. His family on the 80th floor never had a chance. Their bodies were never recovered. John got through the Civil War only by accepting that the old America was over. It was the only way anyone made it through. In the new America, citizens could no longer be trusted with firearms or with ideas about independence and freedom. Those were the things that led to death and misery. America's core historical virtues were now understood as simply being too dangerous for the modern age. And with the advent of global artificial intelligence, there was no longer any need for those kinds of freedoms, or the market-based economy of the past. For the first time since the original COVID shutdown in the spring of 2020, New York City was finally safe from violence. Now the only problem was inflation. The one thing the AI systems and the crypto dollar hadn't been able to stop yet was the ongoing run on the global financial system. No algorithm had yet figured out how to solve the problem of old America's $50 trillion default. So, while John Wilson was finally free of the fear of violence, he now lived in a constant state of financial terror. Every morning, John woke up to discover how much he'd been taxed. And as July 1st was the first day of the third quarter, today's text message was even more important than usual. Every quarter, every citizen's privilege rank was reestablished by the NSA's massive computers, the largest array of AI computers in the world. In the new America, the value of your crypto dollars was set according to your race, your circumstances, the amount of your privilege, and whether you were an essential citizen. The new U.S. digital dollar was guided by the world's most powerful generative artificial intelligence. This AI could adjust the price of everything for every individual in the economy every day. The president promised this would ensure that America would finally be a free and fair society where every citizen would be able to afford what they needed. They said this would end the violence. It would finally create the city on the hill that America had long promised. The AI knew everything about you. It knew everything you owned. It knew your racial background going back 7 generations. It knew your DNA, knew your IQ, knew your education, knew your family's wealth, knew how attractive you were, and everything else that factored into your value to society. And then every night, while you slept, it automatically adjusted your holdings of USDD via the daily tax you paid. And each morning, you'd wake up to discover how much wealth you'd lost overnight and how much more everything would cost you that day. Worse yet, by secretly changing the algorithms, the government could control the entire society without ever having to explain who would pay for anything. Oddly, though, and quite contrary to what the government's economists promised, rather than ending the inflation, the USDD was making it worse. Much worse. John Wilson, as one of the most experienced financiers and economists in the country, knew why. He also knew it wouldn't be long before starvation led to food riots and a return to the violence the new system was supposed to cure. Of course, it had started benignly enough. Most people hadn't even really noticed how much money the government printed during the COVID shutdown between 2020 and 2022. That's when the price of milk and eggs, the basic staples, had increased 400%. The Federal Reserve said the inflation was transitory and was based on supply chain problems. Since stocks went up along with the prices of just about everything else, nobody seemed to care. But that was all before the banks failed. That was before anyone understood what printing more than $10 trillion between 2010 and 2022 had done to our currency, our economy, and our entire way of life. Before the connection between inflation, the falling value of real wages, and the rise in violence had occurred to almost anyone. Everyone should have known what was coming. John did. All the signs of a collapsing society and a civil war were there. A collapse in law and order, soaring violence in the cities, inflation that continued to destroy wages, savings, the middle class, and the peaceful American way of life. America is about to end violently. Our economy is dysfunctional. Our cities are plagued by drugs and crime. Our institutions, politicians, and media have been corrupted. And the glue that once held us together, the unifying belief in American exceptionalism, is dead. Replaced by a new, dangerous set of ideas that not only defy logic, decades of scientific evidence, and centuries of historical precedents, but have sent us careening towards the abyss. Yet despite the writing on the wall, more and more Americans continue to embrace these radical and dangerous ideologies. They demand special political rights, unearned economic advantages, and claim cultural superiority. They demand total adherence to their worldview, denouncing anyone who opposes their warped reality as an oppressor. And perhaps most sinister of all, instead of seeking to provide for society, they make demands of it, usually based on racial, sexual, and identity politics. Dare to question this? You will be silenced, threatened, or even attacked. And instead of attempting to bring us back together, our political and media elites are doing everything in their power to fan the flames of division, because they know turning us against each other is the only way to distract us from what's really going on and to cover up the actual cause of our demise. You see, everything that seems to be destroying America, everything we are told is the root cause of our problems, they are all symptoms of a much deeper problem. A disease that lurks in the heart of the American economy. It first affected the U.S. in 1998 and has slowly been destroying us ever since. And what the elites on both sides of the aisle don't want you to know is that although the symptoms are treatable, the disease itself is terminal. And unless you know what's about to happen, you, along with millions of others, risk not only being wiped out financially, but potentially losing everything. Your family, your freedom, your wealth, your way of life, and yes, even your life. It's all at risk. Fortunately, there are ways to protect yourself, your loved ones, and everything you have worked so hard to achieve. There are ways to not only survive the coming crisis, but to come out ahead, potentially wealthier than you ever imagined. But nobody is telling you how. That's why at great personal expense I've produced this new documentary, and why I'm releasing it for free for all Americans to watch. You'll discover the shocking root cause behind all of the cultural, economic, and financial problems plaguing our nation, and how these problems are converging to trigger an event of unprecedented magnitude, an event that could send devastating shockwaves ripping across every town and city in America in the coming months. I'll also show you how I'm personally preparing for this looming catastrophe. I'll show you the assets I'm buying, the actions I'm taking, and how I'm planning to keep my loved ones safe from the chaos that's coming. I'll also show you why now, right now, could be your last chance to act. Because when you see what's happening behind the scenes in the government, the media, and the financial sector, you too will realize that America is about to end violently. This isn't the first time I've sounded the alarm on this crisis. Over a decade ago, I released the first part of this documentary. And that film, which has now been viewed more than 100 million times, I detailed how the government's bailouts, money printing, and debt burden would lead to a crisis of America's civil society. I warned the coming years would be marked by riots, violence, and destruction. I predicted the government would begin to prey on individual citizens and outlaw our fundamental freedoms. I foresaw the loss of America's AAA credit rating, the never-ending financial bailouts, the runs on the banks. And perhaps before any other analyst, I sounded the alarm on the US dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency. At the time, you might remember, I was laughed at, mocked, and ridiculed for my alarmist predictions. Practically everything I warned of in 2010 has now, unfortunately, come true. Violent crime is surging all across the country. You hear gunfire every night in places like Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, and Miami. The murder rates in many U.S. cities make them more dangerous than the world's most lawless countries like Jamaica and South Africa. Multi-billion-dollar businesses like Walmart, Whole Foods, and Target are closing stores as rampant theft makes them unprofitable. Riots, protests, and looters have gutted entire city blocks, leaving them looking like post-apocalyptic hellscapes. Financially, things are even worse. Banks have collapsed. Bankruptcies are surging. Emergency bailouts were required. And millions of hardworking Americans have been pushed to the edge, barely able to put food on the table for their family. But most shocking of all to the establishment, France, Russia, Brazil, India, China, Saudi Arabia, and others are now settling trade without using US dollars for the first time in modern history. This was unimaginable to DC and Wall Street. When I first predicted it in 2010, it was practically sacrilege to even think it. Yet here we are, a decade later, and those same experts have been completely blindsided by what was so obvious to me. While they scrambled to understand this new world, my readers and I not only knew what was coming, but were able to protect and grow our wealth amidst the changing world order. To my knowledge, no other analyst can match my record of accurately predicting the demise of America over the last decade. That's why my research has been featured on almost every major media outlet, studied by presidential advisors and government economists, and read by many of the world's top financial minds, including Jim Grant, Jim Rogers, Steve Forbes, Steve Eisman, George Gilder, and Bill Bonner, not to mention millions and millions of other investors from all around the world. However, the problems I foresaw in 2010 have now compounded far faster than even I imagined. And now I believe something far worse is coming. In short, we're no longer just facing the collapse of the US dollar, economy, and financial sector. We are now facing, quite literally, the end of America itself. It brings me no joy to say that. I have no interest in trying to scare you, and it's not a prediction that I make lightly. I'm simply following my research to its logical conclusion in order to warn you of what's coming and to help you prepare. I did the same thing when I predicted the 1997 emerging market collapse and the Japanese 1998 banking crisis, the dot-com blow-up of the 2000s, the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, and most recently, when in the early days of the pandemic, I warned that the biggest threat COVID posed was not to your health, but to your freedom. I predicted COVID would allow the government to usher in terrifying new authoritarian controls over your life and your finances. You see, while politicians and the media lie, the numbers don't. And as the data will show you today, we have passed the point of no return, economically and financially. While I can't predict whether this violent end of America will happen this month or even this year, I do know it will happen. Whether it takes 1 year or 5, these changes are inevitable. And unless you act now, the consequences for you and your loved ones could be dire. America was built on an idea. The idea that all people are created equal and are born with fundamental rights, such as liberty, free speech, freedom of religion, due process of law, and freedom of assembly. Our forefathers rebelled against the British Empire's tyranny, taxation, and imperialism to create a new, fairer, and freer world. And over the generations, that vision of America has been a beacon of light and hope to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. A place where anyone, regardless of race, sex, or class, could raise themselves up and attain their own version of success, freedom, and prosperity. The results of this ideal speak for themselves. Last year, America produced a stunning $25.5 trillion in GDP, roughly 25% of the world's total, despite making up only 4% of the world's population. What's more, our income per person is about 30% higher than in Europe and 54% higher than in Japan. But now, this dream is devolving into a nightmare. And what's propping America up is not a healthy, growing economy and a unifying belief in our exceptionalism. Instead, a new dark vision has taken America hostage, a unique form of socialism. And the new American version, special interest groups have raped and plundered our democratic process for their personal gain, all while virtue signaling and grandstanding about their moral superiority. The formula has two parts: demand ever greater income taxes on an ever smaller tax base, and then exploit our dominant global financial position to borrow endlessly to pay for still greater income redistribution. It's an economic system that's like a giant oak with a rotten core. It looks strong, but it's dying on the inside. With each passing day, more and more is being demanded of an ever-shrinking base of taxpayers who, being hopelessly outvoted, not only face financial ruin, but the prospect of their descendants being forced to pay for the never-ending and constantly growing federal debts. Yet despite the wailings of thieving imbeciles like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, the rich do pay their fair share. In fact, they pay far more than what's fair. According to Statista, the top 1% of earners pay for approximately 40% of all federal income tax. And the American Enterprise Institute reports the highest income quintile is financing 96% of the entire system and funding the operation of the federal government. Yet this isn't good enough for the crooks. They demand more, even though higher taxes will never solve the root problem. Just look at the results of Norway's new wealth tax. It was predicted to generate an extra $146 million in yearly tax revenue. But instead, the wealthy moved their money, with roughly $54 billion leaving the country forever. This led to an estimated loss of $594 million in yearly wealth tax revenue. That's a net decrease of almost $450 million. Yet even if the government could raise the necessary money through higher taxes, it wouldn't matter. As famed economist Richard Vedder has shown, every dollar in new tax revenue results in between $1.05 and $1.81 of new government spending. Those economic realities won't stop them, though, because they're not actually interested in solving poverty or racial inequality or climate change or whatever the grievance of the month is. No, they're only interested in control and more power. And those pulling the puppet strings know that the more people who depend on the government for support, handouts, and benefits, the more control they can amass over you. So the establishment and their cronies in the media continue to invent new grievances, stoke division, and most importantly, inspire fear. All so they can demand higher taxes, more spending, more benefits, more inclusion, more diversity, and it's working. Their never-ending manipulations have transformed the U.S. government into a behemoth that controls vast swaths of the country. Tens of millions of Americans now depend on the government for handouts, food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, housing subsidies, energy and utility assistance, child care. The list goes on and on. And this addiction is deepened with never-ending promises of new programs, new entitlements, and new benefits. As Ronald Reagan warned, the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." In order to manage this bloated bureaucracy, the government has grown into a hydra that would sicken the founding fathers. A colossal 22 million Americans are directly employed by the U.S. government. Throw in the people working for NGOs, university departments, government contractors, private-public partnerships, people who are not technically government employees, but who rely on government funding via your tax dollars to exist. And you're looking at millions more, either working for or dependent upon the government. Yet this monstrosity grows ever larger. There's no way to stop it. More importantly, there's no way to pay for it. See, despite Biden's lies about the strength of the dollar, the growth of the U.S. economy, and the shrinking deficit, his own government's data tells the truth. Every year, the Treasury Department releases a report on the financial status of the U.S., and the 2022 data exposes how harrowing things truly are. The net financial position, which is like the net worth of the federal government, is a staggering negative $34 trillion. That's an additional $4.1 trillion in debt just since 2021. The projected Social Security funding deficit also worsened, surging from $71 trillion to $75.9 trillion. And the so-called decrease in the deficit Biden so proudly claims to have achieved, it's an accounting sleight of hand. The real budget deficit, classified in the report as the net operating cost, is a stupefying negative $4.1 trillion. Yet even these catastrophic numbers may not tell the entire story, because the Treasury report also exposed that the government failed its own audit. As the Comptroller General states very plainly, there are numerous material misstatements in the government's financial reporting and in internal controls. Simply put, the U.S. government, according to its own calculations, is totally insolvent. The only reason this house of cards hasn't collapsed yet is because the U.S. dollar remains the global reserve currency. For the last 75 years, global economic trade has been built on the dollar. Foreign companies use the dollar to trade with one another. Foreign governments and corporations often issue bonds denominated in U.S. dollars. And most of the world's major commodities, including oil, soybeans, corn, and wheat, are all priced in and trade in U.S. dollars. In other words, almost every country in the world has to hold U.S. dollars just to trade. In fact, foreign nationals own roughly $7.4 trillion of U.S. government bonds, which is essential to keep our failing economy propped up. This reserve currency status is the only reason we have been able to get away with a multi-trillion-dollar national debt and deficit. No other country in the world could pull off this sort of financial malfeasance without suffering brutal consequences. Case in point, when the markets decided they didn't approve of British Prime Minister Liz Truss's economic plan, the British pound went into a freefall. The bond market plunged, and she was forced to resign after just 49 days in power. The U.S., on the other hand, has been able to do what it wants for decades. But as I first warned back in 2010, our reserve currency status is not guaranteed forever. Throughout history, there have been many reserve currencies. The ancient Greek drachma, the gold solidus of the Byzantine Empire, the Venetian gold ducat, the Spanish real de ocho, the British pound. No reserve currency lasts forever, however, and I believe our status as the world's reserve currency is dying. Again, the numbers tell the truth. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT, reports the use of the dollar to settle international trade has plunged 23% over the last decade. The International Monetary Fund reveals the dollar now accounts for only 58% of reserves held by foreign central banks, a decline of 17% over the last 2 decades. Foreign central banks also bought more gold in 2022 than they have since 1950, signaling further diversification out of the dollar. What's more, leaders all around the world, including our allies, are publicly calling for an end to the dollar's dominance. As Barron's reports, French President Macron asserts the U.S. dollar's status should be knocked down a peg. The Financial Times writes that Brazilian President Lula has called for an end to dollar trade dominance. Saudi Arabia's finance minister has said they're open to trading in currencies besides the U.S. dollar for the first time in 48 years, and are now in talks to join the China-based BRICS Bank. Malaysia's prime minister has proposed an Asian monetary fund to reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar. China and Russia have vowed to significantly increase trade in the Chinese yuan. It's not just rhetoric either. These countries are now circumventing the dollar in international trade, often choosing to trade in yuan, dirham, or rupees. This is a seismic shift. It signals for perhaps the first time since the end of World War II that the U.S. no longer holds the upper hand in economic negotiations. Over the last 2 decades, China has supplanted the U.S. to become the primary trading partner of the world economy, and they're wagering that it's easier for these countries to swap out U.S. currency than to replace Chinese factories. To be clear, I'm not saying the U.S. dollar will cease to exist or that it won't still be used in international trade. I don't believe that, at least not in the near future. Instead, I'm simply stating that the reign of the U.S. dollar as the unchallenged global reserve currency is ending. And although it may take years to unfold, the financial and economic consequences of this shift will be catastrophic. And unless you prepare immediately, your wealth, your family, and your way of life could be at risk by what's coming next. This crisis has been brewing for decades. It began on September 23, 1998, on the 10th floor of this nondescript Manhattan office block, when, without your consent or any semblance of a democratic process, an agreement was made by our financial elites. That one decision, which you've probably never heard of, set the stage for the violent end of America. As strange as it seems, almost all of the cultural, economic, and financial malaise we are plagued by stems from this decision. It began when a new hedge fund was launched, long-term capital management. The founders, John Meriwether, along with Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, both Nobel Prize-winning economists, were considered the smartest men in finance, and their hedge fund was wildly successful, at least at first. By simultaneously selling and buying bonds to capitalize on tiny differences in prices, they earned 40% a year, seemingly without any volatility. No one else could make these trades. No one else had billions in capital, the computing power, or the algorithms to scan across virtually every market in real time. What's more, no one else wanted to make these trades, because in virtually every position the upside was tiny, but the downside, in the event of a bond default, was cataclysmic. So what happened? Economic reality struck in the form of Gresham's law. This is the monetary principle that states that bad money drives out good. And as more and more money was added to the system, as LTCM's assets under management surged from $1 billion to more than $100 billion, the bad money forced out the good. In the 1990s, the bad money was emerging market bonds. In the 25 years prior to 1998, the 22 countries known as emerging economies had seen their external debt loads grow tenfold, far outpacing economic activity. Beginning in 1995 with the Mexican peso crisis, virtually every emerging market suffered a currency collapse, a debt default, or both. Long-term capital management held a highly leveraged position in Russian domestic bonds when the Russian government defaulted in August of 1998. This led to massive losses for LTCM. But instead of eating their losses, LTCM's backers, a cadre of Wall Street elites, appealed to the government. And $3.6 billion in new money was created by a consortium of 14 banks led by the Federal Reserve. That decision, made in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York on September the 23rd, 1998, changed everything in America. It was the financial equivalent of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. You see, it was the first time the U.S. government had intervened directly to prevent credit losses by a private institution. It would not be the last. 10 years later, in 2008, the bad money was subprime mortgage bonds. Wall Street banks had gorged themselves on these risky bonds, creating an enormous yet artificial economic boom led by real estate prices. The resulting collapse and bailout were around 1,000 times greater than long-term capital management's bailout. Considering the direct bailouts, debt guarantees, mortgage repurchases, central bank swaps, the mortgage crisis saw trillions in new money and credit dumped into the financial system. Judging from history, we should have known what would happen next. You can see how the late 90s and the bailout of LTCM marked the beginning of America's super bubble, where household net worth, denominated in dollars, became completely disconnected from real underlying economic activity. And look at how, with each new cycle of boom, bad money, and bust, the subsequent round of money printing has to grow ever larger. Trillions printed to bail out Wall Street in 2009, then again in 2011 to help solve the European debt crisis, and then in 2020 to finance COVID lockdowns, and most recently in 2023 to prevent contagion from the collapse of several banks from bringing down the entire U.S. economy. Each wave of money printing was larger than the last and issued in an increasingly cavalier manner, with the recent multi-billion-dollar rescue of Silicon Valley Bank having been engineered in just one weekend. Following each expansion, the interest offered on government debt was lower and lower. The result is a monetary system that's broken beyond repair. Again, just look at wages. Since the beginning of the printed dollar standard in the 1970s, as money and credit began to expand well beyond real-world limits, the value of wages have become disconnected from gains in productivity, causing wages to decline massively relative to the soaring value of assets. That is the cost of things like your home, land, and your financial nest egg. That's why printed money is so devastating to the middle class and extremely dangerous for civil society. It tells the general population that the economy and the government controlling it is illegitimate. As you can see, public trust in the government has eroded ever since the 1970s. This is why printed money and inflation is always a leading indicator of the most violent forms of populism and revolution. Everything from the witch trials in colonial America to the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s to the storming of the U.S. Capitol in 2021. Printed money encourages politicians to use the government in all kinds of ways that are extremely destructive for society, whether that's invading Iraq or sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Printed money and the lack of any fundamental limit to credit leads to bigger boondoggles because no so-called social benefit is unaffordable. The war on poverty was launched as the U.S. switched to printed currency. The total cost to date is over $22 trillion. Then came the war on drugs in the 1980s, which seems like a bargain by comparison. It has only cost $1 trillion. Most recently, there's the war on climate change at a cost of over $3.8 trillion just in the last 10 years. What did the tens of trillions of dollars in printed money buy us? Nothing. Poverty is worse. Drug addiction is worse. And America teeters on the edge of a violent collapse. What's President Biden doing in response to all of this? Nothing. Instead, he is trying to spend more, which will make the problems worse. His latest budget proposal advocates for another $2.6 trillion in deficit spending. That's on top of the $6 trillion in deficit spending he has already proposed since taking office. As White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says, when you look at the budget, it's a statement of the president's values. She's not wrong. She just doesn't understand these values will lead to an unprecedented collapse in the U.S. economy in the coming years, because there's no escaping the fact that the U.S. will need to print more money to paper over our unsustainable debt burdens. But even they know this can't last forever. And the St. Louis Fed is now warning of potential economic ruin if we continue printing money to paper over our debts. But that's all we can do. As British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher warned us 40 years ago, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. In America's unique form of socialism, other people's money is from both you, the taxpayer, as well as foreign governments and corporations. As I've shown you, though, that well is running dry. Tell me, what do you think happens when tens of millions of people realize they have been systematically lied to by their own government? When they realize their most closely held beliefs were engineered and propagated in order to hand the elites more power. What do you think happens when one day soon none of the banks open, or when there's a global run on the dollar, or when the entitlements disappear, or when the government finally defaults? Do you think that most people will just accept it? Of course not. These are the same radicals who riot, loot, and attack innocent people for the slightest cultural transgression. When the U.S. economy grinds to a halt, there will be an explosion of violence and protests in the streets of every major city. They won't turn their fury against the government, though. No. Their anger will be directed towards people like me and you. The people they have been brainwashed into believing are racist, sexist, privileged, and destroying the earth. I know what you're probably thinking. That won't happen, not in America. And maybe you're right. Nobody knows for certain. All I know is that history teaches us when countries default, when currencies lose their reserve status, and when governments push their people too far, there is always, I repeat always, violence. We can already see the first shots being fired. We saw it in the violent riots on the streets of Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Baltimore, and New York. We see it in the destruction of property, looting of stores, burning of neighborhoods, and open attacks against white and Asian Americans. There are shots being fired just out of view by Soros-backed district attorneys' refusal to prosecute dangerous criminals and allowing them to keep their reign of terror going, and governors declaring an immigrant war on their counterparts in other states, busing tens of thousands of illegal aliens to them. Then there's the sexual and racial propaganda being forced on our children without the parents' consent, and political extremists on both sides of the aisle attacking anyone who dares to question their beliefs. While you may think these events are outliers, they're not. They're becoming the normal state of affairs, and this is all setting the stage for the first large-scale regional violence that America has experienced since the Civil War. I believe one day soon you'll wake up in a completely new America, a new world where the unemployed, the poor, and the cultural warriors are openly at war with those of us that work and save, pay taxes, and build families. The day is coming when, if you've lived the American dream, you will be targeted. You'll be accused of privilege. Your wealth will be confiscated for reparations. You and your family will be routinely assaulted on subways, buses, and even airplanes. Your homes, your stores, and your business will be attacked and plundered. You'll have to band together to survive in the few places where the old America will continue to exist. This isn't speculation. These zealots are openly calling for this violence and are praised by the media and politicians for it. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley says, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there is unrest in our lives. CNN correspondent Sarah Sidner says, nonviolence hasn't worked, and we are going to try to stop this. And Jane Fonda just called for white men to be jailed for causing the climate crisis. This new political mob claims the right to violence. They claim the right to your property and your wealth. They claim the right to censor your speech and to control all the information you receive. They even claim your right to life. They demand all this power in pursuit of their higher good, to protect the planet from the pollution they blame on you, or to make amends for the slavery and the racism they claim you perpetrate, despite decades of affirmative action. And they aren't just coming for your wealth and your freedom. They want to destroy the very foundation of our culture. They want to destroy every vestige of the core idea that our nation was founded on, the sovereignty of the individual. They will take away your privacy. They will take away your right to free speech. They will rig elections. They will rewrite our culture's history. They will deny your gender. They will do everything they can to destroy the very idea that you, as a sovereign individual, exist apart from the state. And they will win. Because most of you watching this documentary don't even realize there's already a war underway. It's a war you're losing. And because so much of what's been stolen has been covered up with political lies, you probably don't even know how much danger you're in. The reason America hasn't yet splintered into radically different and openly warring groups is that our core cultural, political, racial, and economic differences have been papered over for years with debt. That is, to keep the peace, government spending on both social programs and homeland defense has soared, leading to massive budget deficits. The numbers are simply astounding. It took more than 200 years for our government's debt to reach $1 trillion, but we've been adding at least that much every year since 2010. These debts have long since become impossible to finance through taxes. We've been printing trillions since 2010. That is about to change, abruptly. Printing so much money over so many years made huge inflation inevitable. To prevent a complete collapse in the dollar, the Fed had to move interest rates dramatically, faster than they'd ever been raised before. That puts our entire political system at risk. There is no way for the government to afford its debts at any real rate of interest. Look at how much the government's interest rate payments have soared in just the last year. And as more and more of these debts roll over and to higher and higher rates, the government itself will go bankrupt. They won't call it a default, though. The government will never admit it's bankrupt. So what happens next will not be called a bankruptcy or default. You'll know when we're bankrupt when a dozen senior politicians come out to promise that the dollar will not be devalued and our economy is sound. But a pig in lipstick is still a pig. It happened in Britain when Prime Minister Harold Wilson pledged not to devalue the pound before turning around and devaluing it by 14%. But when America does it, the consequences will be far worse. The entire modern financial system is built on U.S. Treasury securities and the U.S. dollar. That means what's about to happen will impact the entire world. One day, very soon, you'll wake up to realize that every bank in the country is closed. They will promise that your money is safe, but it won't be. All your savings will be confiscated, and going forward, you'll have to use a new digital form of money. That means the end to all private property and to all privacy. It's for the good of the country, you'll be told. Or maybe because it's necessary to stop a new outbreak of COVID. Or maybe because of a war with China or Russia. A reason will be found, trust me. They will never admit the real reason, though, the fact that they bankrupted our entire country. Of course, there's no way to predict exactly how they will try to cover up their massive default. All that can be known now is that it's definitely going to happen. And that's what will turn the embers of the war we've seen into a full-blown inferno that consumes and destroys our nation. How do I know? Well, in addition to more than a decade and a half of exhaustive research into this brewing crisis, I also have a high-level government informant. Over the course of my 25-year career as an economist, author, and founder of the largest financial publishing firm in the country, I had the privilege of meeting and talking with some of the smartest men in America. Titans of Wall Street, billionaire money managers, politicians, famed economists, best-selling authors, CEOs, and countless others. But none of them hold a candle to who I call the Metropolitan Man. And despite the evidence I've shared with you today, you may still doubt whether our financial problems could lead to widespread violence, even war. I did too, until 2016. That spring, I was summoned to a private dinner at perhaps the most exclusive club in the United States, the Metropolitan Club. Built by the legendary banker J.P. Morgan at the turn of the 20th century, the Metropolitan Club's massive stone building sits at the corner of 5th Avenue and 60th Street in New York City. It's metaphorically and physically the cornerstone of the city. It's long been the favored venue of our country's most powerful financiers. It's where Warren Buffett hosted his 50th birthday, for example. I'd been invited to dinner by one of the most powerful economists in America. For 40 years, he sat at the absolute nexus of Washington's most senior policy circles and New York's largest financial firms. For obvious reasons, he doesn't want me to disclose his name or some of the more sensitive topics we discussed. But what he told me shocked me. And quite honestly, I didn't fully believe him at first. But everything he told me has since come to pass. The Metropolitan Man told me that the government's financial problems were leading directly to a secret civil war, and that it had already begun. He told me that at the very highest levels of government, a coup was underway to destroy President Trump. The rationale for doing so was simply survival. Trump was planning to destroy the deep state, the means by which the government manipulates and controls the country. Trump was planning, for example, to release all of the Kennedy files, which prove that the CIA murdered JFK. The Metropolitan Man also explained in precise detail how the most senior leaders of the Justice Department, the CIA, and the FBI were going to frame Donald Trump by accusing him of colluding with the Russians. And as you know, all of those things came to pass. In fact, the shocking details of this secret coup were recently revealed in the bombshell Durham report. When I asked him for proof 7 years ago, he explained how, as evidence to smear Trump, the leaders of the conspiracy were using materials that were so secret he couldn't even tell me what the level of top secret was called. That the leaders of the CIA, the FBI, would violate the government's most important security laws to frame Trump convinced him they would do anything to stop Trump from being elected. But it was what the Metropolitan Man told me next that was most concerning. He said he'd spent the week fielding calls from senior members of large investment banks who were looking for help to buy gold. He explained that he'd never seen that before, ever. He was certain that monetary policy was going to become stuck in QE infinity, as the government could not possibly balance its budget or finance its debts at any real rate of interest. In his mind, then, an economic collapse was inevitable, that our financial problems could, in the current political climate, lead to an open civil war. As I mentioned back then, I was skeptical, but also very concerned. Years later, almost everything the Metropolitan Man warned about has come to pass, and the drums of war are beating. And what's coming next for America is infinitely more serious than any crisis I've seen or studied in my lifetime. How bad will it get? Honestly, I don't know. All I know is I'm preparing, and you should too. Because I believe in the very near future, you'll wake up to hear reports about ATM machines not working across the country. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon will appear on CNBC to explain that, for the good of the country, his bank, and all the other banks in the country, we must all take a pause and stop withdrawing cash from the system. The economy will grind to a halt. The government will pause entitlement benefits. And their stooges in the media will parrot the same talking points. That this is temporary, no reason to panic. You'll be told the military patrolling the streets is for your own protection. That the shutdown of the banking system, the government control on all commerce, and the martial law is for the greater good. But as the days go past, people will start to turn on one another, and protests will turn violent and escalate. And from there, things will quickly spiral out of control. Again, I don't know when it will happen, but my research and connections lead me to believe it's unavoidable. Yet almost nobody knows what's coming. There's not a single Wall Street bank, not a single mainstream news source, not a single leading politician warning you. No one dares to comment on this looming financial crisis. No one will explain what is happening and why, nor will they ever. Instead, their efforts to maintain their power and position in our society will grow ever more desperate, more despotic, and more violent. That, in turn, will trigger ever more political division and ever more violence. This sort of unraveling has happened to practically every society in history with this much government spending, this much debt, and this much military power. It happened in Venezuela and Argentina, Yugoslavia, Zimbabwe. It happened in Germany in the 1930s, and it will happen here. When this crisis arrives, it will trigger a chain reaction that spreads throughout the entire system and that can't be stopped. Riots, protests, looting, chaos, social collapse, and eventually war will follow. Again, maybe you're saying that won't happen, not here. If so, just remember, no one believed me a decade and a half ago when I said the world's largest mortgage bankers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, would fail. No one believed me when I warned one of the world's largest automakers, General Motors, would go bankrupt. No one believed me when I said there would be a complete breakdown of law and order across America in the years ahead. No one believed me a few years ago when I warned the biggest threat COVID posed was not to your health, but that it would hand the government the cover it needed to grab even more power and control over your life and your finances. Yet, even as people see the early warning signs of what I call the violent end of America in their daily lives, they continue to believe our country is somehow different, somehow immune from the lessons of history. It isn't. And unless you act now, you could lose everything in the coming war. Again, my goal with this documentary is not to frighten you, but rather to educate you so that you can take the necessary actions to prepare and protect. If you understand, accept, and most importantly, act on this information, you will not only survive the chaos ahead, you have the potential to use it to grow your wealth far beyond what you ever imagined. You see, as the violent end of America unfolds, I believe certain assets and investments will become invaluable, not only for safeguarding your wealth, but for growing it in the years ahead. In fact, if you follow the simple steps I'm going to outline today, you could see significant gains with relatively little risk. These are the same steps I'm personally taking, and that I am advising my friends and my family to take too. They're simple and straightforward. Still, I know most folks will ignore them. They'll refuse to accept the truth of what I've laid out here today. And when what I have described comes to pass, it'll be too late for them. I urge you not to be one of those people. Because while the steps I recommend you take today are easy, if you wait until the crisis hits, these steps will become impossible. And listen, even if my violent end of America thesis takes years to fully arrive, you could still make a lot of money in the near future, because each of the steps I'm about to share with you is, in my opinion, ideal for today's current investing environment. Of course, when the real crisis finally and inevitably hits, these same investments could go parabolic, handing you potentially huge returns in the years ahead. First, you should take advantage of this final period of relative strength in the US dollar to diversify into alternative stores of value. This includes sound money like gold and silver, which could soar in value against the depreciating dollar. You see, the average lifespan for a global reserve currency is roughly 100 years, and the dollar became the dominant currency soon after World War I, which ended 105 years ago. The dollar's position was then solidified as the reserve currency in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Accord. This established the rules of the game for the global monetary system. Since then, the dollar has lost more than 90% of its purchasing power, as measured by the U.S. Consumer Price Index. Gold, on the other hand, has a 5,000-year history of maintaining its value and preserving wealth. That's right, holding physical gold is not for making money. It's for preserving your wealth and savings. So I urge you to allocate at least some portion of your investable net worth into physical gold, either coins or bullion. Then, when it comes to growing your wealth with gold, there is one investment I recommend you make immediately. Over the last 15 years, this investment has quietly delivered twice the market return, but I believe it's only just getting started. This business, which I doubt you've ever heard of, transforms gold from the ground into a near endless profit stream for its investors. It's not a mining company, though. Gold mining is a terrible business to be in. Digging miles into the earth to explore for and extract gold is incredibly capital intensive. It's the opposite of what I look for in investments. Miners need to spend enormous sums on labor, capital, and finding new reserves. And that's money that doesn't go to shareholders. Instead, this gold company is the kind I love. It's a little-known, capital-efficient business that outperforms both gold and gold mining stocks, and even many of the most widely held tech stocks. all while offering you the ultimate protection against the violent end of America and the chaos that will ensue. You see, instead of exploring and digging for gold, this company provides financing for the gold mining companies that do the heavy work. In exchange for providing capital, the company receives a percentage of the revenue generated from the sale of gold, net of the cost of smelting. And secondly, streaming deals. The company also receives a percentage of the refined gold from the mine, which it can then sell at market prices. The firm I want to share with you has long-standing partnerships with the largest mining companies on the planet, and their performance over the last decade shows the genius of their unique royalty strategy. It has generated compound annual returns of 17%, more than double the returns of the S&P 500 for close to a decade and a half. And unlike the mining companies that are forced to funnel most of their earnings back into the business, this firm converts a stunningly high percentage of its revenues into free cash flow. In fact, it generates more than twice the free cash flow margins of Microsoft. Like I said, my team and I believe the best is yet to come for this royalty firm, and potentially huge returns could lie ahead. That's why I want to give you all the details of this unique company, along with the ticker symbol, the buy up to price, the short and long-term catalyst for the company, and a full analysis of its potential. It's all inside my new briefing, Better Than Gold. I'll tell you how to get your copy in just a moment. But first, I want to show you what else I'm doing to prepare for the violent end of America. A few months ago, I started to invest heavily in the one asset that has the most to gain from the demise of the dollar. Over the last decade, it has transformed from a fringe speculation into a mainstream financial asset. Goldman Sachs, Citi, JP Morgan, all of those big banks transact with it. And Fidelity, one of the world's largest money managers with $12 trillion in assets, offers this and their 401k retirement plans. Yes, I'm talking about Bitcoin. And while I was a long-term skeptic, I now believe Bitcoin is arguably the best alternative to the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Whether you agree with me or not, I think Bitcoin is something every investor should have as part of their portfolio. When Bitcoin dropped below $20,000 per coin in the fall of 2022, I began buying heavily, $10,000 worth of Bitcoin per day. I continued these purchases for months and only stopped buying when the price moved well above $20,000. I believe buying Bitcoin when it's trading for below its average hash cost, which means its cost to mine, is a smart move to make. Because in my view, Bitcoin is the ultimate form of money and could be viewed as history's greatest investment a decade or two from now. For the shorter term, however, it's still a long way from a widely accepted financial asset, and it will remain highly volatile. That's why I'm not recommending you invest directly in Bitcoin unless it drops below its hash cost again. But instead, I'd like you to look at this unique Bitcoin investment. It's an opportunity that allows you to potentially profit from Bitcoin, no matter what direction it goes in the short term. That's why my team and I have developed a way for you to capture the upside potential of Bitcoin while minimizing your risk. For instance, if Bitcoin continues to rally, you're looking at the potential for returns as high as 173%. In the downside case, where Bitcoin falls to 10,000, a decline of 67% from current prices, you would still see a positive return. And that's without ever investing in Bitcoin directly. In other words, this is a way for you to profit from Bitcoin without the complexity or the volatility often associated with cryptocurrencies. You don't need to worry about setting up new accounts, purchasing and storing Bitcoin, or tracking the price. Instead, you purchase what we call a Bitcoin bond to reap potentially huge profits while strictly limiting your risk. All the details of this strategy, along with step-by-step instructions on how to execute the trade, are inside my special briefing, Better Than Bitcoin. I'd like to send you this new report along with Better Than Gold and one more titled Better Than Buffett. Warren Buffett has been buying oil and gas companies for the last few years like never before. They're among the biggest bets he's ever made. And recently, he's been adding to his Occidental Petroleum holding hand over fist. Now you can buy what Warren Buffett is buying, and you'll likely do very well. In fact, that's one suggestion I'd like to make to you. Buy Occidental Petroleum. The ticker symbol is OXY, and it's fast becoming a linchpin of Buffett's portfolio. Buffett now owns 24% of the company, and that's not including the warrants from his Anadarko deal. If Buffett exercises his right to buy 83.8 million more shares at a price of $59.62 each, Berkshire will then own over 30% of Occidental Petroleum. Of course, Occidental is a mega-cap stock, and it's no secret that Warren Buffett loves it, which of course limits its upside potential. So while OXY remains a great investment, there is a secret to potentially making far greater profits in oil and gas companies. And I'd bet not more than 1 in 1,000 investors knows anything about it. I learned this secret from legendary energy tycoon T. Boone Pickens. The secret he shared with me is a way to separate the cash flows from the overhead and the risks of the oil business. And I believe it's ideal for the months and years ahead. You see, even as the violent end of America drags the global economy down and sends shockwaves ricocheting through the system, oil and gas will remain essential. It's what powers the global economy, with fossil fuels still providing more than 80% of the world's energy supply. And as the decline of the dollar ends our ability to subsidize the green energy movement, oil and gas will be in even greater demand. What legendary oil man T. Boone Pickens taught me remains one of the best ways to take advantage of this. It's a way to turn a capital-intensive business into a capital-efficient one. They don't have to pay any of the production costs or take any of the developmental risks. They own the mineral rights, and all capital and operating expenses lie with the operator. That means, as inflation continues to drive energy prices higher, the mineral rights they've acquired in the past become more and more valuable. These royalty companies can make investing in oil and gas much safer. They transform a capital-intensive industry into a capital-efficient one that's virtually guaranteed to produce increasing returns across time. In fact, these companies, they're not really businesses at all. They're just a legal fiction that can generate enormous wealth by separating the value of the resource from the risk and expense of production. Well-run mineral rights businesses are truly one of Wall Street's greatest secrets. Case in point, the leading Permian Basin royalty company has averaged an incredible 77% free cash flow margin over the last 5 years. And since going public in 2014, its production figures have grown nearly tenfold, from average daily volume of 3,000 barrels of oil equivalent to 28,000 in just 8 years. Investors have reaped the benefits, with the stock outperforming the broader energy sector by a factor of 3.5 to 1 since its inception as a public company. But this isn't all you'll discover inside Better Than Buffett. This briefing features 2 energy royalty companies that we have circled for outsized gains. The first is, in my opinion, the best oil and gas royalty company in the energy sector. It's one of the most capital-efficient businesses you'll find anywhere, with 80% free cash flow margins. It currently trades at a 15% free cash flow yield, the best valuation since the COVID-19 pandemic, meaning it's in the perfect buying window. The second is one of America's largest natural gas mineral owners, with an asset base spanning 20 million gross acres across 41 U.S. states. Its capital-efficient royalty model converts over 60% of revenue into free cash flow, and the company is enjoying rapid growth due to rising U.S. LNG exports. It has a pristine balance sheet with no debt, pays a 12% dividend, and trades for less than 9 times free cash flow, providing you the potential for considerable income and appreciation. All the details of these companies are inside my report, Better Than Buffett. And I want to send you a copy of this briefing, along with Better Than Gold and Better Than Bitcoin. To get instant access, all you have to do is accept my invitation to join the world's most elite investment group, Porter & Company. And there may never be a more critical time to join with us. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I believe what's going on in America will have catastrophic consequences in the years to come. Good people are going to suffer because our society has become incapable of having honest conversations and addressing problems head on. As you can tell, I don't have that problem. I'm a pragmatic and direct person. I follow the numbers, my team and I conduct in-depth research, and I inform my subscribers about what's coming. We report unflinchingly on what we find. And I don't really care if it offends people. That's why I've had a target on my back for 25 years. The establishment has tried to sue me, silence me, and slander me at every possible turn. They don't want people like me to have a voice because I don't pander or embrace ideas I don't agree with. But they'll never stop me from doing what I do best, which is speaking my mind and helping others grow their wealth in a country whose leadership does not want you to be wealthy anymore. Because there aren't many firms in the world outside of captured research teams inside hedge funds, banks, and private equity firms that have our research ability and that can produce actionable insights the way we do. Ideas that are original, proprietary, and incredibly valuable. And there are no firms that I know of that are providing this level of research to individual investors in a way that's straightforward and easy for you to understand and act on. Our goal is really simple. We want to give you the information we'd want if our roles were reversed. That's what I've been doing for the last 25 years, and the results of my unbiased, unflinching approach have been incredible. I could give countless other examples, both from my own research and from the analysts that work for me. But what's happening now is far more important than the past. I believe the potential impact of this story could be greater than anything I've ever warned of before. There's no escaping this violent end of America. It will impact every citizen, every aspect of society, and every industry. In fact, it could be the most important economic story in the world. Yet no other analyst has connected the dots in the way I have. Now, I want to make sure you, your loved ones, and your finances are prepared for what's coming. And I believe there's no better way to prepare than by grabbing the special briefings I just told you about. Taking the actions revealed inside Better Than Gold, Better Than Bitcoin, and Better Than Buffett will, I believe, help ensure you come out ahead. So when the inevitable comes to pass and America violently collapses, you and your family can sit safely inside a fortress of wealth. I'm talking about the kind of wealth you can depend on, you can plan on, and that could sustain you and your family for decades. If that kind of wealth and security is something you're interested in pursuing with me, I want you to join A Big Secret on Wall Street. This is our flagship financial advisory service. It features our model portfolio, our latest investment idea, ongoing updates and analysis of our existing recommendations, and much more. You'll be getting a meticulously researched, easy-to-read investment briefing every single week. Each issue is chock full of wealth-building insights you won't get anywhere else at any price. Each of our investment letters will explore a new investment opportunity or trend in exacting, exhaustive detail. I'm talking about research and investment ideas that are out of reach for all but the most powerful and privileged investors. Again, outside of research teams, inside hedge funds, banks, and private equity firms, there is no one else producing research like this. But here's the difference. Our research is written in plain English, not inscrutable Wall Street jargon. Now, in addition to everything covered so far, your annual membership to The Big Secret on Wall Street and your special investor briefings, Better Than Gold, Better Than Bitcoin, and Better Than Buffett. You'll also get access to our entire backlog of The Big Secret on Wall Street. Every issue has an investment idea I'm willing to bet you've never seen anywhere else before, including our report on the gods of gas. In this report, you'll discover a little-known company that's disrupting the global energy markets with the potential to become one of the world's largest and most important energy firms. A report about treasuries on steroids. This obscure REIT that doesn't invest in any physical real estate pays a double-digit annual yield with very limited risk. A report about a matter of national security. Discover why America's most closely guarded national secret is also the world's ultimate energy solution. To make following our recommendations as easy as possible for you, each and every Big Secret on Wall Street stock pick is logged and tracked in our model portfolio. This makes getting up to speed on our investments a snap for new subscribers. And of course, you'll get updates on positions in each issue and special alerts when needed. Once you decide to join us, we'll pull the curtain back on some of our most valuable and closely guarded investment strategies. As a new member, you'll get the Guide to Distressed Investing, the Guide to Capital Efficient Investing, the Guide to Property and Casualty Insurance Investing. If we sold these investment guides individually, we'd most likely charge several $100s for each of them individually. But you can't buy them anywhere for any price. They're exclusively for our members, and you'll get them at no extra cost. These are just a few of the reports and special resources we have planned for you. Every year, I host a meeting at my farm in Maryland for our best contacts and other well-known investment writers and a small group of elite investors. All of this and more is waiting for you inside the Big Secret on Wall Street. And right now, I'm giving you a 30% new member discount. Typically, membership is $1,425 per year. But as a special offer to new members, you can join today for only $1,000. That's a savings of more than $400. That's less than $3 a day for access to financial research that we invest millions of dollars to produce. And it has the potential to forever transform your family's finances and future. To claim your discounted membership, simply click the button below this video. You'll be taken to an encrypted webpage where you can review everything waiting for you and secure your spot inside. Plus, on that page, you'll find there's another bonus waiting for you. It's called The Goldman Sachs of White Trash. Funny title, but it's a briefing that details a very serious investment about a subprime auto lender. Now let's be honest, owning shares of a business making subprime loans to rubes and poor people isn't going to endear you to the public or to the progressives. But I don't really care. This is a phenomenal business. It's profitable, capital efficient, and generated 63% free cash flow margins over the last 5 years. Today, it trades at a very cheap price, only 13 times earnings. As you'll discover in the briefing, it's also one of the best ways to potentially profit from the violent end of America. And when you join the Big Secret on Wall Street, you'll get instant access to this investor briefing at no extra cost. All you have to do is click the button below and take advantage of this special offer while it's still available. If at any point you decide the Big Secret on Wall Street isn't right for you, just contact my team and we'll issue you a refund minus a small 10% cancellation fee. To take advantage of this special discounted offer, simply click the button below this video now. Or if you prefer, you can call my office and speak with my staff directly. All the details are listed on the next page. So go ahead and click the link below now while this offer is still available. I'll see you inside.